Welcome, everybody. My name is Nick Tran. I'm proud to represent Schlumberger and the World Affairs Council. I believe in our mission to help our community better understand the world that we live in, its politics, its people, its economies, and cultures. It is my great honor to introduce to you a scholar, a soldier, a patriot, and a selfless leader who spent his entire life in service of others in our country. Allow me to give you a little insight of our special guest today. Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1984. He later earned a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. His doctoral thesis about the failure of military and political leadership during the Vietnam War, which later became a well-known book titled Dereliction of Duty. During Desert Storm, he served as commander in E Troop, 2nd Squadron, 2nd Cavalry Regiment. During this deployment, 2nd Squadron was the only American ground unit to find itself significantly outnumbered and outgunned. Nonetheless, the unit destroyed 2 Iraqi brigades. In this campaign, Captain McMaster led a tank unit in the Battle of 73 Easting and was awarded the Silver Star, the nation's 3rd highest medal for valor. As if being awarded the Silver Star was not enough, he earned his true fame later in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2006. The New Yorker magazine described his unit as rebels against incoherent strategy. At that time, the US strategy was to stand down and allow Iraqi forces to take over combat operations against the insurgency. Colonel McMaster went against that doctrine and said that we can't train the Iraqi forces until we stabilize the situation. He pushed his troops into the city of Tal Afar to effectively crush the insurgency before any rebuilding and retraining efforts could begin. Colonel McMaster's counterinsurgency success in Tal Afar helped change the US strategy in Iraq. In June of 2009, H.R. McMaster was promoted to Brigadier General, and in July 2010, he served as a Deputy Commander for Planning at ISAF in Kabul, Afghanistan. Lieutenant General McMaster served as the National Security Advisor for President Trump from February 2017 until March 2018. He remained on active duty during this time and later retired from the Army in May of 2018. In that same year, he accepted an academic appointment to Stanford University. He has 3 daughters with his wife, Kathleen Trotter McMaster, and currently resides in Palo Alto, California. It is my great pleasure to present to you Dr. and Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster.
And Rowan and the whole World Affairs Council team for the privilege of being with you.
Well, thank you very much, General, and thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you very much, Nick Tran, a great board member and a great American. Thank you for your service and for doing the introduction today. General, I will say it's truly an honor to join you. I'm sorry if it looks a little bit different. About 2 minutes before we're supposed to start, my Wi-Fi, my internet went down at my house, so I just switched to my phone. I just want to say it's truly an honor and a privilege to host you. Not only are you one of the U.S. military's premier kind of military strategists, you're also a renowned foreign policy expert and an incredible historian. It's rare that I would recommend 2 books in the same event. This is probably the first time I've done it in probably 8, almost 9 years. But a lot of Americans who may have known of you before becoming National Security Advisor might know you for Dereliction of Duty, your incredible book that basically is considered one of the most seminal, the most important books regarding the Vietnam War, and in particular about describing the complete breakdown in communications between the administration and top military officials, and beyond that, obviously, there's the absolute and complete lies. I suppose what you were hoping people take from the book, and I suppose what you think U.S. Foreign policy planners and military leaders did take from the book, and say from Vietnam itself. What lessons do you think there were that we should have learned from that? And in some ways, was our incredible success, and you're a big part of it, in the first Gulf War, the absolutely very fast and lopsided success. In some ways, did it make those lessons perhaps resonate less so, and maybe we didn't take those lessons to heart for Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, Ronan, thank you. Thanks for that great question and for the privilege of being with you. I do think that we were flushed from really twin victories in the Cold War and in the Gulf War in the 1990s. It was a period of overconfidence that led to complacency and maybe even a bit of hubris. I think in the post-Cold War period, we forgot many of the lessons of Vietnam in large measure because we thought we won, right? We won the Cold War. Ideological competition was over. A related assumption was that great power competition was a relic of the past. And then, of course, we had this orthodoxy of this revolution in military affairs in the 1990s, where after having demonstrated our technological military prowess in the Gulf War, many assumed that the U.S. military would remain so dominant that our security was guaranteed. And I think all of these assumptions were a setup, a setup for the strategic shocks and difficulties that we encountered in the 2000s. Of course, foremost among them, the most devastating terrorist attacks in history on September 11th, 2001, when terrorists, Al-Qaeda, used box cutters and airplanes to bypass our technological and military advantages. And then followed by the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And I tell the story in Battlegrounds of how we began those wars under flawed assumptions, and especially a neglect of the need to consolidate military gains to get into sustainable political outcomes in both places, and how the short war mentality actually paradoxically lengthened those wars and increased the costs associated with them. And then, of course, the 2008 financial crisis shook our confidence even further. And I think it was then that the emotional impetus behind our policy, foreign policy, our national security strategy shifted from overconfidence and complacency to pessimism and almost resignation. And we began to see, I think under the Obama administration in particular, our disengagement from complex problem sets overseas as an unmitigated good. So in the book, what I describe is how maybe under the George W. Bush administration, that administration undervalued the risks and costs of action. Under the Obama administration, we tended to undervalue the risks and costs of inaction. And as a result, our policies have been inconsistent and based in what I call strategic narcissism in Battlegrounds. And
I suppose just briefly related to that, just in case people will find it out once they read the book, you are politically apolitical on purpose. You mentioned taking the model of George Marshall. You mentioned that you haven't voted. I suppose you felt as a military officer, perhaps as a way to say disconnected from the political apparatus, or at least being influenced by it. You mentioned obviously strategic narcissism, and perhaps in very basic terms that George Bush perhaps expected the U.S. to be able to do too much, and then Obama conversely maybe overbearing pessimism, the idea that we shouldn't be able to do anything. Can you talk about how maybe both administrations in a lot of ways maybe misunderstood not just the Americans' role, but what the roles of others would have in terms of predicting outcomes? And then perhaps between those two extremes, how or where would you place the foreign policy kind of guidelines of President Trump?
Right. Well, I describe strategic narcissism as our tendency to define the world only in relation to us, which is a problem because it's self-referential, but it also assumes that the future course of events depends on what we decide to do, and doesn't give adequate consideration to the agency and influence and authorship over the future that others enjoy, particularly rivals, adversaries, and enemies. A strategic narcissism is applied to China, for example, generated this assumption that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules, would liberalize its economy, and as it prospered, would also liberalize its form of governance. And of course, we know that isn't the case. So I argue for us to employ strategic empathy. And in particular, this is a phrase I borrowed from the historian Zachary Shore, who's a great scholar, a great author. And it's essentially a concerted effort to view complex challenges from the perspective of the other, and to pay particular attention to the emotions and aspirations and ideology that drive and constrain the other. I believe that we put a process in place, I'd be happy to talk more about that, when I was National Security Advisor, to avoid both the pitfalls of Vietnam that I wrote about in Dereliction of Duty, and to address this problem of strategic narcissism, having been on the receiving end in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, that of policies and strategies that I think were based on fantasy in Washington rather than reality on the ground in those places. So, I think the Trump administration has in recent months showed signs of strategic narcissism. and Afghanistan is probably the most extreme example in really the conjuring up of a Taliban enemy that we would prefer rather than the actual Taliban enemy. And this is this myth that we created for ourselves, right? That there's a bold line, between the Taliban and other terrorist organizations that pose a threat to us and all civilized peoples. And I think that has resulted in a destructive foreign policy in which we've essentially, partnered with, with the Taliban against the Afghan government, and done so in a way that actually put the Afghan government in a position of disadvantage. I mean, I think that it would have been actually in some ways better just to leave if withdrawal was the option, rather than to enter into a deal ourselves with the Taliban, and then to coerce the Afghan government into releasing 5,000 of some of the most heinous people on earth, and give up a lot of their leverage. So I think that, across Battlegrounds in the book, I criticize all administrations, but I also try to point out significant policy accomplishments. And in the Trump administration in particular, I think the greatest accomplishment is the shift to a competitive stance with the Chinese Communist Party, for example.
And before turning back to Iraq and Afghanistan, just maybe the two chapters you opened with, obviously the two major powers we're going to be contending with for a long time to now and many years from now going forward. There's a lot of excellent information in there with regards to Russia. But one of the things I think that you highlight and others do that I think still a lot of Americans have a hard time understanding is Russia's role within trying to influence elections in the United States or in Europe or in other liberal democracies is not necessary to specifically pick a winner one way or another. They don't necessarily think they will push the votes one way or another enough to get Trump elected or Hillary elected. But can you talk about how the real objective is to create doubt and create division and distrust within our democracies to make us doubt our own systems? So I suppose in comparison, President Putin's form of government doesn't look as bad.
Right. Well, Russia's strategy is a strategy of disruption, disinformation, and denial. Russia is driven, and again, in each of these chapters, what I try to do is understand how the past produced the present. That's the first step before making suppositions about the future and recommendations on about how to counter, in this case, what I call as Putin's playbook, right? And his playbook, Putin's playbook, is based on this approach of disinformation, disruption, denial. But what Putin recognizes is that he can't compete with us head to head. His economy is about the size of Texas's economy, for example, and he has some real problems of his own these days, in particular with the COVID-19 pandemic, the collapse of oil prices. Demographics are not in Russia's favor these days. So I think he realizes he has limited resources. Of course, a very dangerous country with nuclear weapons. But what Russia hopes to do is drag us all down under the theory that he'll be the last man standing in Europe after European countries and the U.S. are weakened by the sustained campaign of political subversion against us. You mentioned 2016, and I tell the story in some detail there about how Russia did prioritize first really dividing us on issues of race primarily. About 80% of the bot and troll traffic from this internet research agency, the Front Organization for Russian Intelligence, was on issues of race. The idea it was to polarize us, pit us against each other, and reduce our confidence in who we are. Also, as you mentioned, I don't think Russia cares who won that election. I don't think Russia cares who wins this election in a couple of weeks. What they really want to do is ensure that whoever wins, we doubt the result, because they want to reduce our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And so we've done a lot to defend against this. I lay that out in the book, but we need to do more. And in particular, we have to stop being our own worst enemies. We have to, we have to come together as Americans. We have to do what the World Affairs Council does and help educate one another on the greatest challenges we face, and to work together, really maybe prioritizing what we can agree on, because I think we can agree on quite a bit in the issues that we face, and we all desire to strengthen our country and create equality of opportunity for all Americans, and there's a lot we can get behind. And so in the book, I describe this as strategic confidence, and this is really our confidence in our ability to implement a sustainable and sound foreign policy, but also confidence in ourselves and our common identity as Americans. I quote Richard Rorty, who said that national pride is to countries what self-respect is to individuals, a necessary ingredient for self-improvement. And so I think we ought to make a concerted effort to restore pride in ourselves, and that will help us compete more effectively internationally as well.
And thank you. And just turning to China, I think to me, one of the more interesting points you made was as part of the delegation that went with the administration of President Trump to Beijing as National Security Advisor, you were one of the few people to be allowed on the kind of private behind the scene tour of the Forbidden City. And I think a lot of ways, as you mentioned, from the Chinese perspective, the idea was to wow and amaze you, but you kind of came away with a different correlate to that. Was that in some ways you felt they realized they might have a kind of closing window with regards to what they could do and how they can do it. But can you also talk about maybe if the Chinese think they may have a kind of a narrowing window with regards to what can or cannot be done? Do you think the United States as well also maybe has a narrowing window with regards to coming up with an effective policy to challenge China as they rise, becoming increasingly stronger and autocratic?
Right. Thanks so much, Ronan. Well, we're behind. So we're re-entering arenas of competition that we vacated based on that fundamentally flawed assumption. And what I write about in the book and what I concluded during that visit is that the Chinese Communist Party leadership are driven by a combination of fear and ambition. Fear of losing their exclusive grip on power internally, and an ambition to realize the China dream, what the party describes as national rejuvenation, what Xi Jinping said in his October 2017 speech right before President Trump's visit to Beijing, that it was time for China to take center stage in the world. And what we're seeing is an increasingly aggressive China, stifling human freedom internally with a campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang, the extending of the party's repressive arm and their technologically enabled surveillance police state into Hong Kong, but actually much more aggression externally as well, as it exports its authoritarian mercantilist model. It uses debt traps to set for countries to create servile relationships in an effort, I think, to create exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region and then to challenge the United States globally. China ultimately wants to be in a position of preponderant advantage in the emerging data-driven economy globally, as well as in a position of preponderant advantage militarily. They do this by pursuing military civil fusion. There is no difference between a Chinese company, so-called private company, and the government. Those companies have to act as an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. And China is in a race under this program Made in China 2025 to extract as much technology, develop technology, but really steal as much technology and intellectual property as they can through a sustained campaign of industrial espionage, and apply that to these differential advantages militarily and economically. China has increased its defense spending since the 90s, mid-90s, of over 800%. It's the largest peacetime military buildup in history. These are all really causes for concern, because if the party succeeds in its ambitions, the world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. I do believe that China is more aggressive now in the wake of COVID-19 because it sees this fleeting window of opportunity to take advantage of what it sees as favorable conditions, closing more rapidly. This is why I think you see aggression on the Himalayan frontier, where the People's Liberation Army is bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death. This is why you see much more aggressive action in the South China Sea, where if China succeeds, it will be the largest land grab in history. You see just in recent days reports of China marshaling hypersonic missiles across from Taiwan and threatening actions toward Taiwan and toward Japan in the Senkaku's Islands. This wolf warrior diplomacy that you see across the world, sustained cyber attacks against our medical research facilities and pharmaceutical companies in the midst of the pandemic, right? So I think that the evidence is there, and what the evidence indicates is that we have some fundamental misunderstandings here in the United States about the nature of this competition. I think what you often hear, Ronan, these days is, this is really us trying to keep China down, and maybe because Donald Trump is so mean that Xi Jinping is acting out. Well, I think just by looking at China's actions, this is not a U.S.-China problem. This is a China free world problem. And the second myth, I think, these days it has to do with it. Hey, we're not really cooperating with other countries internationally. There is actually a high degree of international cooperation. It needs to be magnified and expanded. But more and more countries are recognizing, the need to work together to promote a free and open system. For example, the Quad Ministerial that was just held in Tokyo is an example of India recognizing, hey, it's time to work more closely in this format of India, Australia, the United States, and Japan to promote our democratic systems and our free market economic system. And then the third myth is that, hey, we face this false choice, what some people describe as a Thucydides trap associated with a rising power and a status quo power. I mean, our problem is not with a rising China. The problem is with aggressive policies of the Chinese Communist Party that are inhumane and that are promoting a system that would place us and our children and future generations at a disadvantage. So I think it's important to understand the nature of the threat from China, and then, as you allude to work together to counter it. I could go on more about how to counter it, but essentially the theme in the book, in this one chapter, is turning weakness into strength, turning what the Chinese perceive as our weaknesses into our greatest strengths. And I think these are our greatest strengths. It's our democratic system of government. Hey, we have a say in how we're governed. We can demand better from our government. We do have free speech and a free press. That's a source of strength, especially when you look at really some of the effects that really good investigative reporting have had on exposing China's campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment. We have rule of law. China fears rule of law because it would threaten the rule of the party, right, and not allow it to build concentration camps in which it is now brainwashing over 1 million Uyghurs, for example. Rule of law is our strength, promoting democratic principles, institutions internationally. That's a tremendous strength for us. It's not just good-heartedness. It's our best practical way to counter the aggression of the Chinese Communist Party.
And just to turn to Afghanistan and Iraq, our most recent wars, as you point out in the book and others, the kind of precipitous withdrawal in 2011, there's no guarantee, but more than likely ISIS would not have swept into and taken over about a third of Iraq if we still had a presence there. But to Americans, both Democratic and Republican, who are perhaps war weary, how do you explain to them, and you talked about the Taliban as well earlier, who would say, well, if it's not Afghanistan, terrorists will go to any kind of ungoverned or poorly governed area or failed state, whether it's in Mali or Yemen or Syria. How would you say is the best way for the American public to understand the need to kind of maintain a presence in, say, Afghanistan or Iraq, and why a military presence on the ground is necessary, more than just, say, special forces capabilities or quick strike abilities from a drone or a cruise missile?
Right. Well, thank you. I would just say that I'm more frustrated maybe than most people about our ineffective and inconsistent strategies in the Middle East and in South Asia, centered on the problem set in Afghanistan, Pakistan. And I understand why Americans are frustrated. I'm frustrated too, and have been for years. But what I would point out is that a lot of times you hear this kind of endless wars with a reference to our almost now 20-year long war in Afghanistan. The story I tell in the book is not the story of a 20-year long war. It's the story of a 1-year war fought 20 times over due to these inconsistencies and these ineffective strategies. What we need is a sustainable and sensible approach to these problems that prioritize the protection of our country and our interests abroad. And that strategy is one to enable others to bear the brunt of this fight. In Afghanistan, just as an example, it's certainly important to recognize that 10 of our soldiers gave their last full measure of devotion. They made the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan to keep us safe. But 30 Afghans a day die fighting to preserve the freedoms that they've enjoyed since the end of Taliban rule in 2001. So I think it is supporting partners who are worthy of our support, who will join us in what I think is in large measure a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization there in South Asia. As you mentioned, terrorist safe haven support bases are really important to deny anywhere, because safe havens do give these groups the opportunity to recruit more effectively, to raise revenue, to deliberately plan, prepare, and then execute attacks against us. Of course, it's not a theoretical case, right? This is exactly what happened on 9/11. It's exactly what ISIS was able to do, with ISIS planned and inspired attacks all through Europe as well, when they were in control, as you mentioned, of territory the size of Britain. So I think that we have to recognize some geographic areas, however, are more important than others. And certainly this so-called Khorasan region, the ancient Khorasan region, which spans Pakistan, Afghanistan, parts of Iran, has a great deal of emotional, ideological importance to terrorists, as does the Fertile Crescent in Syria and in Iraq. And these are areas where these jihadist terrorist organizations want to begin to establish their caliphate, a caliphate in which they would apply brutal Sharia, and a caliphate that they would use as a base for attacks against, the United States, the far enemy in Europe, and the near enemies of Israel and the Arab monarchies. So, if you think ever that, hey, the situation in the Middle East couldn't get worse, it actually can. And I think it's in our interest to remain engaged there to prevent the worst from happening.
And when it comes to Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, I suppose part of the great difficulty for policy is a lot of times there are only a selection of bad choices. It's trying to pick, the relatively least harmful of the options. But say if it's in Afghanistan, it's 18 years of Pakistan supporting the Taliban or providing safe haven in the Fatah areas for insurgents. Or in a place like Iraq, even if they are democratically elected, if you have people like Maliki, who completely divided the country and rose up with Shia militias, what can we do? I mean, there are great possibilities like Abadi, who you befriended in Tal Afar early on in the war. But if the population in Iraq elects a very divisive leader such as Maliki, what can we actually do? Or in Afghanistan, what can we do? We can only fight the war so much if Pakistan is still basically supporting the Taliban.
Well, these are all good points, and we're not going to solve everybody's problems for them. We need to have strong, viable partners. When we've been successful in the past, it's been in partnership with strong indigenous leaders. I think, look at Plan Colombia as one example. It's one that I use in the book. I also use Korea in the book. But these are long-term endeavors, right? In the 1990s, until President Uribe took over in Colombia looked like it was on an inexorable trajectory, path toward state collapse and utter state failure. Then the United States, along with strong leadership, implemented Plan Colombia, and Colombia is not out of the woods ever, but is a vibrant, successful country. The prospects were pretty dim in Korea in 1953, after a war in which nearly 50,000 Americans gave their lives. But we remain committed there in South Korea. The prospects were dim in a country with it was really just denuded, by decades of war, with no natural resources, an illiterate population, a corrupt government, and a hostile neighbor. Right? Prospects look pretty darn bad. And it really wasn't until the economic reforms of the late 70s, the democratic reforms that followed later in the 80s, that South Korea really began to reach its potential and is now the 5th largest economy in Asia. So I would just say that there are no short-term solutions to long-term problems, but we have to be able to explain to the American people, what is at stake? So what? Why do they care? And then the second part, the second thing the Americans need to know is what is a strategy that will deliver a favorable outcome at an acceptable cost. And I just don't think our leaders have explained either to the American people very well in recent years.
And just for the sake of time, I won't cover everything in the book, but maybe just 2 more questions, then I want to turn it over and open it up to the audience. Iran, you cover in detail, excellent dissection of everything there and your positions. And but to turn to North Korea, in some ways, it's the rogue state that has nuclear power now. in the long run, you talk about the different methods of trying to convince Kim that they're better off without nuclear weapons, and some people might say, well, they have nuclear weapons for defensive reasons. You and others might say they also very well might have them, even more frighteningly, for offensive capabilities. But at the end of the day, when there are examples like Gaddafi or Saddam who didn't have nuclear weapons and they were deposed and ultimately killed, how do you realistically convince the North Koreans that it is an urgence to give up nuclear weapons if they feel they're an existential part or an existential threat to their regime? And then I suppose similarly, if you have to get China on board, China does not like having 30,000 US troops in South Korea, and it really doesn't want to have 30,000 troops on its border if the regime was to fall and have millions of refugees. How do you get China on board, and how do you convince North Korea to, I suppose, pursue a different path?
Well, in North Korea, it's really through this campaign of maximum pressure to convince Kim Jong-un that he's safer with them than without them. I think the Iraq analogy actually is helpful in convincing that he may be safer without them than with them, because really it was Saddam's desperate efforts to convince us that he did have weapons of mass destruction and did have a vibrant program that convinced the Bush administration in part. It was part of the fact that what was taken into consideration in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But I think that what is important to note about North Korea is that North Korea already has a tremendous deterrent capability conventionally, based on the fact that Seoul in South Korea lies within artillery range of thousands of artillery guns and rocket launchers. So North Korea's always had a conventional deterrent. So then why does it feel like it really needs this nuclear program? Why has it made so many sacrifices in pursuit of nuclear weapons and missiles? And I think we have to at least be open to the possibility that it wants nuclear weapons for the reason the Kim family regime has stated across several decades. It wants it to be able to unify the peninsula under the red banner. And I think the first step in doing so would be to use extortion, nuclear extortion, blackmail, to drive the U.S. off the peninsula as the first step in isolating South Korea, as maybe a first step in isolating Japan as well, and then to engage in a sustained campaign of subversion. I think it's also worth pointing out, that every act of aggression since 1950, June of 1950, when North Korea invaded the South, has been perpetrated by the North, not by the South, not by the United States. And so I think the assumptions that you make about North Korea's motives are important, and I think we ought not to assume that they want nuclear weapons for the same reasons why we have them, which is for deterrence purposes. The other aspect of this is the breakdown of the non-proliferation regime, and this gets to your question about how do you convince China. I mean, I don't think it's in China's interest to have a nuclear armed North Korea, because I think it's just a matter of time before Japan at least has a conversation about, well, do we need one for deterrence ourselves? Or South Korea, who had a nuclear program years ago, which we stopped, right, by making clear that South Korea was under our nuclear umbrella, and this was important for us to prevent proliferation in South Korea. And I think it's really important to note, North Korea's never met a weapon it didn't try to sell to somebody, right? And North Korea was actually building a nuclear reactor, helping to build a nuclear reactor to jumpstart a Syrian nuclear program. And it wasn't until Israel bombed that facility in 2007 that we even knew about it, right? So I think, I think it's really important to examine what drives and constrains the other. It's obviously a theme in the book, and we need a strategy that's designed for that reality rather than the kind of mirror imaging of our adversaries. And then on North Korea, I think a good approach would be to at least not repeat the failed pattern of previous efforts. And I think that's why it's important the Trump administration has hung on to the strategy of maximum pressure, didn't give in, didn't give concessions to Kim Jong-un, for example, during the failed summit in Hanoi. It was good that was a failed summit, in other words. And so there's more that can be done. There are unprecedented UN Security Council approved sanctions that could be better enforced. Secondary sanctions are an option. I mean, sanctions on Chinese banks that are facilitating illicit trade and financial flows could be an option. Interdiction and employing maybe Article 2 authorities from the U.S. perspective to interdict ship-to-ship transfers and other efforts to circumvent sanctions. There are other means, that we can't talk about, to increase pressure on North Korea. So I don't think we've exhausted the strategy, and I mean, it's not clear that it would work, but I think we ought to test the thesis that Kim Jong-un can be convinced that he's less safe with them than he is without them.
All right, great. And thank you, General. And if you all would bear with me, as my internet crashed before this, I'm doing it all on my phone. It's quite hard to read these questions and do it all from a small screen, but I'll do my best. Just to summarize, Beth asks about the Global Health and Biodefense Unit in the National Security Council. Can you talk about, I suppose, its status and what you think basically should or should not be done with regards to our preparedness for global pandemics such as we're facing now?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Beth. I think it's important to have that office at the NSC staff, and the reason is of the convening authority, the convening power that a senior director has to bring together the departments and agencies. I mean, the real gift of the NSC staff since 1947, the NSC has been to break down these stovepipes across the government and to fashion more effective plans and strategies, and also to assist with the sensible implementation of responses, in this case a pandemic response, but any biomedical emergency. I had identified over several administrations 3 critical tasks for a biomedical response. The first is to stop it close to its origin through better global surveillance and containment at the source. Well, thanks to the Chinese Communist Party, we couldn't do that. The second is to mobilize a biomedical response. This is where we saw the greatest friction, especially associated with fragile supply chains that over many years became very fragile because we had prioritized efficiency over resiliency in those supply chains with PPE and so forth. We also saw, in terms of mobilizing the biomedical response, a breakdown in coordination and sharing of data. I mean, we have to recognize that we have a federal system. That means we have to coordinate across our departments and agencies at the federal level, but also between federal and state and local governments. And in healthcare, we have a combination public and private system. So we also need to share authoritative and transferable data, across the public and private sector. And then there have been inconsistency in communications, obviously, about the pandemic and measures to take to mitigate the spread of the disease. And then the third area is biomedical innovation, the rapid development and distribution of therapies, as well as the all important vaccine. I think that third area is going to be seen in retrospect by historians as a win, based on investments made over several administrations, and the agility with which we've been able to develop therapies, and then to make progress on what I think will be an effective vaccine very soon. So what do we learn from all this? I've been really disappointed in the vitriolic, partisan discourse about COVID. And so I worked with a team called the U.S. Civilian Corps, as well as our team here at the Hoover Institution and our amazing graduate and undergraduate students. And we put together an effort to learn the lessons of COVID-19. Ronan, I can send that to you. Everybody should be able to find it on the internet pretty easily. But Hoover released this study that we did based on oral history interviews that we did with those who were at critical points in the response to this crisis. And so we learned from them, and we've archived their oral histories here at the Hoover Institution for those who want to do more research on this topic. We involved policymakers in these interviews and in the process, as well as congressional staff and offices of governors, so that they were in on the beginning of the study, and now they're receiving these synthesized lessons learned as well. So I'm super proud of our students who worked on this. It's a real example of how it took a younger generation to take on this work, wring all the partisan vitriol out of it, and produce, I think, an extremely useful study with very specific recommendations that are important to getting through this pandemic, as well as preparing effectively for the next one.
All right, great. And you touched upon it somewhat, but related to that, Richard asks, some people feel the current National Security Advisor has been accused of politicizing the position. I suppose, what's your perspective on that? And I suppose, how would you describe the role of the NSA, National Security Advisor, and do you feel the National Security Council needs to be reformed?
Yeah, I would just say that there is a danger to developing and implementing foreign policy in a way that is seen as partisan. That danger is of course, that all of these challenges we're facing takes all of Americans to overcome them and requires us to work together. None of these challenges actually target us on a partisan basis. Right? It's worth pointing out that the mass murderers of 9/11 didn't target Democrats or Republicans; they targeted Americans. And then, of course, if our foreign policy becomes so colored by partisanship, we'll continue this tendency of administrations defining their foreign policy mainly as in opposition to that of the previous administration. And then, of course, we can't implement a consistent foreign policy, and then that's disconcerting to our allies and friends, and it gives opportunities to our adversaries. So we want to avoid politicization of our foreign policy. I endeavored to do that. I served as National Security Advisor in uniform. And I think a National Security Advisor has 5 responsibilities, all of which can be carried out in a bipartisan manner, certainly to implement the elected president's policies and the elected president's agenda, but to do so in a way that focuses really on these five key tasks. The first is to staff the president, to help prepare the president for his or her engagements on foreign policy. The second is to run a process that I think should aim to present multiple options to the elected president. So that president has a say in determining his or her agenda and implementing his decisions, not to give one shiny consensus position. And then to assist with the sensible implementation of those decisions and policies across the government. The third is to communicate the president's decisions and policies to relevant audiences. That can be the American people. I prefer not to do that. I had to do it quite a bit though, because maybe some members of the cabinet were not as vocal as they might have been. But also to key legislators on the Hill, senators and congressmen and women, and then foreign audiences and so forth at times. And then the fourth task is to try to achieve unity of effort with like-minded partners abroad, and in particular our allies, and working with other national security advisors, sometimes heads of state and sometimes other members of foreign governments. And then the fifth is to lead an organization, right? To lead a staff, to provide them with purpose, motivation, and direction, as we would say in the Army, but then also to create the right environment that fosters an environment where there's respect for one another, where they come to work every day knowing that they can make a difference. It's an environment of collaboration and commitment to one another and to their overall mission. And you want the organization, of course, to be trusted and valued across the U.S. government and with foreign governments as appropriate as well. So that's what I endeavored to do. I never felt like a partisan tension in doing that. I did create a process that was insulated from domestic political considerations because of what I had learned from writing Dereliction of Duty. And I think that worked fine in that 13 months I was there. I think those who give the president advice based on domestic political considerations, of course, they still have a voice and have an opportunity to give the president their views. But I think it is quite possible to do that job in a way that serves the elected president very well by taking a tone of nonpartisanship. I've not seen Robert O'Brien's behavior that I would categorize as brazenly partisan. I hope that the national security advisors in the future see the benefit of trying to transcend at least vitriolic partisan discourse and focus on the substance of the issues.
All right, I have a question here. We usually don't say people's last names, so just in case I won't. But from a retired colonel, Dave L., he asks, should our foreign policy be based on stability in the world rather than never-ending neo-Wilsonian view of recreating the world in our own image?
Well, I think what we ought to do is help those who want to help themselves, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to impose our version of democracy on other countries, right? I mean, it takes others to make that decision for themselves. But in countries that do want to strengthen democratic governance through strengthening democratic institutions and processes, in countries that do want to strengthen rule of law, for example, by creating insulated investigative and adjudicative bodies, for countries that do want to foster a free press and a culture of investigative journalism that helps hold government accountable and also maybe expose malign foreign influence in that country. I think that those are all actions we can take that are more than altruistic. They're actually the best way to compete with authoritarian and closed systems, and especially the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to use those systems, or the Russian government's effort to use corruption within governments to create client relationships and advance their interests. So I think it's it is certainly sounds Kantian in its purpose, but I think it's also consistent with just hard-nosed John Stuart Mill utilitarianism to be able to support fledgling and growing democratic governance.
All right, and just two related questions. I might just put them together. Kevin asks, is our strategy on Iran working? And with regards to the impact of the GCC diplomatic relations, what's the impact of the growing diplomatic relations of GCC nations with Israel? And Michael asks, what's your view on the United States leaving the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, and what is a realistic outcome for, I suppose, talks with Iran?
Well, thank you for these great questions. They're helping confirm in my mind that hopefully I've focused on the right answers to those questions, the answers to these and other questions in Battlegrounds, because there's a lot on these topics in the book.
Excellent.
But I'll summarize quickly here. I think the strategy toward Iran is working. I think that over several administrations, many administrations, really almost going back to the Carter administration, have been enticed, convinced themselves that an approach of conciliation to the Iranian regime would bear fruit, right? And it hasn't worked out, right? It's a little bit like Charlie Brown trying to kick the football, and what we've experienced is that whenever we think that there's a possibility for reform in the nature of the government, and especially the Iranian regime's permanent hostility to the great state in the United States, the little state in Israel, our monarchies of the West, we're disappointed. I think it is fair to say at this stage that there was a struggle between revolutionaries and Republicans in Iran, or hardliners and reformers, however you want to categorize them. But the revolutionaries won, and they're in charge. And the supreme leader, the Guardian Council, the RGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, they really set the agenda for foreign policy. The people that the regime puts forward as shop windows, this would be President Rouhani or the Foreign Minister Zarif, are there really to deceive us as to the regime's true intentions, which is to continue and in many ways expand its 4-decade-long proxy war against us, to drive the U.S. out of the Middle East as a first step to isolating Israel and placing a proxy army on the border of Israel. It's doing this, it's pursuing these hegemonic designs in the region in large measure by trying to keep the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict itself. This is through the application of the Hezbollah model, in which that there are weak governments in power that are dependent on Iran for support, while Iran grows militias and other illegal armed groups outside of that government's control, so it can be turned against that government if that government acts against Iranian interests. You see this in Iraq and Syria and in Lebanon, certainly, and then this is what they're attempting to do in Yemen as well. So I think it's worth countering this sustained campaign and proxy war. And the way to do it, I think, is to force the Iranian regime to make a choice. You can either be treated like a pariah state as you continue this proxy war, or you can give up the proxy war and then be welcomed into the community, international community, and you can break out of this this economic isolation associated with sanctions. I do think, though, that we don't want to take credit, for the problems of the Iranian economy. We should give full credit to the corrupt regime that's in power, in which the RGC and the Bunyads are the beneficial owners of most of these companies that are engaged in rent-seeking behavior and diversion of resources that ought to belong to the Iranian people. So I think it's working. I think that JCPOA, to answer the other question, was a mistake. It was a political disaster masquerading as a diplomatic triumph. I argued to the president that he ought to try to stay in longer, because he can get out at any time, and staying in was meant to incentivize fixing flaws in the deal associated with the sunset clause, the lack of verification mechanisms in place, and how circumscribed the Iranians made the sites that we could visit, taking military sites off the table, for example. But then also to ensure that we sanctioned activities that lay outside the deal, and so the government had to make a choice, right, one way or the other. So I think it's working. I think the resources available to the regime are much diminished, and as a result, they're having a hard time making payroll for their proxy army in Syria. The collapse of the Lebanese financial system also hurt them badly. They had a lot of their money in there that was essentially a Ponzi scheme, being run by a corrupt network that was influenced in large measure by Hezbollah. So I think that Iran's in a difficult spot, and they should be in a difficult spot because they're the largest state sponsor of terrorism, and they're continuing this proxy war against us. And then on the Abraham Accords, I think that is a tremendous positive development. I think what it does is it signals really two dynamics in the region, or highlights two of them. One is that countries in the region realize that the real threat to the region comes from Iran, and countries like the UAE, Bahrain, and others actually tacitly, if not explicitly, understand this, that their security interests align with those of Israel in this matter. And then I think the accord is also very important because I love the name, because it really alludes to the fact that we're all people of the book, and it isolates jihadist terrorists as well from sources of ideological support and an effort to cloak their perverted interpretation of Islam in any kind of degree of religious legitimacy. So I think that is a trend to be exploited. Of course, there is also the short term, I hope, and maybe enduring decision not to annex the West Bank that I think would have had some very significant negative second and third order effects for Israel's security. And so it also opens the door for maybe a new administration to start working again on this impossibly hard task of Israeli-Palestinian peace. So, gosh, I could go on about this in the least. There's a lot more in the book. Thank you for those great questions.
And lastly, just for the sake of time and maybe to kind of combine, I suppose some of the aspects of different people's questions. Obviously, Americans were comfortable with keeping large number of troops in Europe for decades, in South Korea for decades, but also millions of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Americans served and died in World War II, and then later, obviously, large numbers, tens of thousands died in Korea. Is part of the issue that now with the all volunteer force, it makes for an excellent, cohesive professional fighting force, but such a small percentage, less than 1% of the U.S. population serves, and a lot of those people are multi-generational, like yourself. Your father was in Korea, and some are even husband and wife serving. Is part of the issue that Americans are disconnected from the military and what they're actually doing to serve, and therefore they're maybe not as cognizant or willing to kind of take on politicians who have poor choices with regards to foreign policy?
Yeah, I think our professional military is more disconnected from those in whose name we fight and serve, and this is a danger. It's a danger because if Americans don't understand the requirements of military service, they won't provide the resources, right, through their members of Congress to maintain a strong defense. If they don't understand the warrior ethos, right, why the warrior serves, why the warrior is willing to make sacrifices, I think that the effect will be it'll cheapen and coarsen the warrior ethos, and then we'll understand military service mainly through the flawed lens of Hollywood or video games, for example. So I think there's a significant danger here. We can all work on this together. I think that what magnifies the danger is Americans being disconnected from issues of foreign policy. That's why the World Affairs Council is so important to me, and I have such a soft spot in my heart for the work that you're doing, Ronan, and the whole team does. Because if we don't understand the wars we're fighting as well, we won't demand ethical strategies, let alone effective strategies from our leaders. And so one of the purposes of Battlegrounds, I hope, is to help Americans understand better the challenges we face, so that we strengthen our voice in demanding a more sensible approach to competitions, and competitions including war, these wars that with which we've been engaged since 9/11 in particular.
Well, again, I just want to let everyone know your signed copy of Battlegrounds. We'll probably give it about 2 or 3 weeks to get processed and shipped out, but it will be sent out to you all soon. And I know you're all going to find it fascinating. Honestly, these are two, to me, most important books of really U.S. foreign policy of the last kind of 40 or 50 years. It does an excellent assessment of what we've done and where we've gotten to, but also what our options are going forward, which I think is positive. And I just again wanted to thank Nick Tran for the introductions today. And I want to thank all the veterans joining us today for your service and for all that you do, and Combined Arms for the great work you're doing here in Houston. And General McMaster, honestly, it's truly an honor and a privilege for myself and the entire council and everyone attending. It's truly an honor to host you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Rowan, the honor's mine. Thank you so much, and stay well, everyone. What a pleasure it was to be with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.